Good afternoon. I'm Paolo Maggiolini, Associate Research Fellow at ISPI and Research and Lecturer at the Catholic University of Milan. Today, I welcome you to our virtual panel, Jordan Beyond the Royal Rumble. And as the title well described, today we will look at Jordan beyond the most recent issue of the alleged coup. But we will focus on the challenges that the country is experiencing, and we will discuss which are the key factors that can enable the kingdom to achieve those reforms that are under discussion since 2013 and more recently 2018. Let me first remember that this meeting is part of a series of virtual events co-organized with a prestigious international specialized organization ahead of the 7th edition of the RoMed Dialogue, which will be held from the 2nd to the 4th December 2021, hopefully in an in-person format. So today, why this virtual panel of Jordan? As we know, in the last two decades, Jordan has experienced multiple challenges to its stability. The kingdom has confirmed its ability to deal with developments and threats, and given its position in the geopolitical map, this is of utmost importance. Some of these challenges stemmed from the region. This went from the ongoing geopolitical competition to wars and conflict at its borders. In this regard, we can just think about tension raised by the Trump plan, all issues related to possible impact of the Abraham Accord on Jordan's traditional role in the region. But other challenges developed within its domestic political field, and they are connected to the necessary political and socio-economic reforms that have been recurrently promised but not yet fully implemented and achieved. Since 2018, I insist on this date because are at least 2 years that we are witnessing this dynamic. We witness rising protest and dissent. Last years, these have culminated in some significant political events. In this regard, we can mention the issue involving teacher association or the Association of Muslim Brotherhood. And today we know the alleged coup with many speculation around it. In any case, without mentioning the burden and responsibility of taking care of the numerous refugee community hosting in the country, today what is sorely concerning is the economic condition of Jordan, and in this field, the impact of the pandemic. And here I'm referring, for instance, to the growing level of the national debt, contraction of the Jordan GDP, and the high rate of unemployment, particularly affecting youth. In any case, these are only few of many issues at stake, but today we have 4 most distinguished speakers that will help us to assess and evaluate Jordan's present situation. So let me introduce them and thank them for being with us. We have Zaid Ayadat, Director for the Center of Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan and lead of Learn Jordan Working Group. Welcome, Zaid. Katarzyna Sidlo, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Department, Center for Social and Economic Research, Holland. Welcome, Katarzyna. Tuka Nusairat, the Deputy Director of the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East Program at the Atlantic Council, where she oversees initiatives on promoting security, human development in the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome, Tuka. And finally, Besma Bomani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. She's also Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance and Innovation and non-resident Fellow at the Arab Gulf State Institute, Washington, D.C. Welcome, Besma. So before giving the mic to our speaker, I would like just to remember to all participants that they can submit questions to our panelists through the chat on this platform, or they can write their question through other application where the webinar is streamed. So in this way, we start to collect questions since the beginning, but we will answer them in the second part of the webinar. So, Zaid, let me start from you. Just to begin, I think it is important to give an overview of Jordan's present situation. So how do you assess Jordanian attitude and perception amidst the current economic challenges and the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Paolo, and good evening to you. I'm delighted to be among very special experts to discuss Jordan's situations beyond the world rumbles. And also let me extend my gratitude to SP for organizing such an important webinars and seminars, including this one in Jordan. To address directly your question about social attitudes, or if you wish, perceptions of Jordanian of their economic and social situations in a way of assessing Jordan's status quo today, I will be unfortunately bringing very negative numbers and not very optimistic future if we look at the perceptions, attitudes, and also opinions of Jordanians and some experts as well. And there are a few issues that have been consistent over time, which led to much more challenges the governments over time also been facing. The first of which is the trust gap. So in Jordan, we're talking about a widening, deepening trust gap between citizens and the institutions. And on the top of these institutions that the public do not trust at all, on the top of that is the government and the consequence governments. And we've been recording this over the last 20 years. So there is a problem, and a huge problem, when Jordanians do not trust their governments. And therefore, whatever the governments do, even if it is honest about what they are doing and trying to do, the perception is not in the mood to receive the government's, let's say, policies, priorities, agenda, and everything is questionable. So this widening trust gap also is not limited to the government. The public opinions shows that Jordanians don't trust also the parliament. And, you know, if the citizens do not trust their representatives, this actually raises a lot of important questions. Why you choose them at first place. And this will lead us totally to the issue of elections in Jordan, electoral law, and the elections by design, and all the criticism that we know about Jordan's elections. Just for example, latest elections that took place back on in October of 2020, October, November, only less than 30% of the populations who are eligible to vote participated in that elections. In our recent polls about what extent Jordanians trust the parliament and their ability to do their job, and it is the highest number we get since 20 years, and it's only 32% of Jordanian trust the parliament can do a good job or deliver to the duties they have to do. And that, you know, you can imagine and extend that to other institutions in Jordan. The two important institutions that still actually receive Jordanians' trust and support is the army and the security agencies. And this huge raise important, huge question and begs for explanation why that is the case. So that is the first one, is the trust gap. Now, if you bring the issues of perception on corruption and doing in Jordan, this will add to the trust gap and deepen it. So perception of corruption in Jordan is too high among Jordanians in both the public and the private sectors. And that is also a very serious issue that actually reflects itself on the trust issue, as I presented at the very beginning. Now, whether the perceptions are accurate, are correct, the cases that Jordanians talk about in their social media and daily life about the corruption and corruption scandals, whether they're true or not is not too important, because perception is too strong in this case, and just color the entire picture of how citizens perceive governments and governmental institutions practices. Now, more importantly, majority of Jordanians do not see that things are going in the right direction. And this is a constant and ongoing question we ask over time with the weekly pulse that we initiated or with the larger public opinions we do at the CSS. So over time, there is a trend. Majority of Jordanians, when I say majority, more than 65 actually, not more than 50, they do not see things are going in the right direction, which means, again, they lost faith in the ability of the governments and the existing institutions and existing political process to deliver to Jordanians' demands and needs. Worse, they do think when it comes to the economic issues that their situation today, their economic situations today, is worse than it used to be 12 months ago. And it will be worse after 12 months than it is now. So that tells you that they lost faith and optimism at all. Now, the scary numbers, of course, when it comes to poverty and unemployment, and reports been saying that the poverty in Jordan has increased more than 80% over the last few years, which means that adding more than 500,000 people under the poverty line in Jordan, which millions of people living under poverty lines, and the unemployment rate has increased highly. Officially, it is 24.7.9 in the fourth quarter, and it is more than 55 among youth, and it is much higher when it comes to female. So in the gender issues, it is so concentrated. Now, this goes without saying, unemployment with poverty, with lack of trust, with perception of corruption, with vision that things will be even worse in the future. That tells you about the situations and explain easily all the social tensions in Jordan and the discussions about the possible social unrest. The social cohesion issues is really serious in Jordan. Now, if you also add to that, I have a lot of numbers. I don't want to just, read the numbers for you. Maybe I will pick some of them because, in the exercise what we've done at the center, the CSS, regarding Jordan's possible economic scenarios, the best possible scenario will lead that Jordan will have its economic recovery at the best situations 3 to 4 to 5 years if they implement immediately what they have to do in terms of vaccination and bringing all economic sectors back to work, with the government only yesterday saying that they cannot even do it before July 1st. And our prediction was they have to do it actually on March latest. Now, they're not starting reopening the sectors, nor giving the vaccination. Less than 1% of Jordanians been vaccinated, and this has been going very, very bad. So if you take also what the COVID impacts has added to the economic situations, to the perceptions of the government and the government practices, the way the government has managed both the health crisis and socio-economic crisis associated with that, that also tells you about the situation in Jordan. So all what I'm trying to do is just bring all these numbers to show to what extent all of these situations are reaching a dangerous level that could seriously threaten social stability in Jordan and internal stability in Jordan. Now, if you combine that with two important things, and I'll stop here. I know I have 4 minutes to say. The death of politics, and I would like this to be underlined, death of politics in Jordan. There is no political process in Jordan. There is no political dynamics in Jordan. People are left behind and away. They pushed away from being part of the decision-making process or even the public discussions about decisions and the directions the country should take. People just, are just surprised about the decisions made by the government, and they have no clue why the decisions are made, on what basis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the death of politics, meaning that the processes did at all, and that's why the consensus today in Jordan is about the need for political reform. And the last thing is about the identity crisis and the divide within Jordan. Jordan is not as simple as it looks. It's very complicated when it comes to social fabrics. It is divided. And at some point I can confidently say it is deeply divided in so many different lines. So that, in all, tells you that situations in Jordan are not that good.
Thank you so much, Zaid, for your overview that allow us to launch our discussion. To come to Katarzyna, I would like to ask you, what is your understanding of the current economic condition in Jordan? And what are Jordan's perspective for the future? So we can keep what Zaid said and bring further through your perspective.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. Now, I'm afraid my message is not going to be very optimistic either. When you think about the economic situation in Jordan, even before the pandemic, it has not been great. The economic growth has been stalled for a couple of years before the pandemic emerged at roughly 2% growth. The unemployment has been persistently high, of course, among women and the youth, especially. And the country has been very heavily reliant on foreign assistance. And the foreign debt has already amounted to over 90% of Jordanian GDP just before the pandemic. Now, COVID-19, of course, as everywhere else, just exacerbated the situation. So the GDP, by the latest data, declined by 1.5% during the first 3 quarters of 2020, which actually is not that bad when you compare with the average for other countries in the MENA region, which is around 3.8%. But some other numbers don't really look great, unfortunately. So the central government debt has gone up. I think CSS actually estimated that it was by 10% at the end of 2020 compared to 2019. Then we have the current account deficit that widened, actually nearly doubled again, according to CSS. And this has been mostly due to the collapse of the tourism sector, which of course suffered throughout the pandemic all over the world. Now, in case of Jordan, it accounted, the tourism and travel sector, it accounted for roughly 18% of GDP and roughly 19% of total employment in 2019. And this is a lot. This is double the global average, which is around 20% for both. So what we have seen is that the pandemic killed both the foreign tourism and domestic tourism. I apologize, my neighbors decided to start renovation now. So also internally, the internal tourism, domestic tourism has also suffered, and the broadly understood hospitality tourism, like wedding halls being closed. So in the third quarter of 2020, the income from foreign tourism equaled roughly €1 billion, which is roughly 2.6 billion fewer than in 2020, the year before. Now, of course, that led, among others, to increase in unemployment. As I mentioned before me, the official rate for the third quarter of 2020 is 24.7%, but the actual unemployment rate is likely much higher than that. Of course, unemployment among women and young people is even higher. So when you look at this recently released data for the fourth quarter of 2020, the unemployment rate for women was nearly double that than for men. And now, looking at the upcoming months, it doesn't look like when it comes to the unemployment situation will really improve. There's been some recent reports in the press about warnings coming from a representative of trade unions and business associations that said that most likely they will have to undertake mass reductions in employment. So for instance, with the clothes, textiles and shoe trader, they announced that they might have to let go around 56,000 workers if things don't change, on the top of closing a significant number of establishments. On the top of that, we have Jordanians coming back from abroad because the economic situation in other countries is not great either. So this both contributes to higher unemployment rates and to the remittances going down. And again, I will quote the report by CSS, by Professor Yadat, which says, estimates that the remittances from Jordanian expatriates in 2020 were lower by 12% compared to 2019. So the situation does really not look great. And in the short term, it will really depend on the pace of vaccination. Again, as they said, only around 0.6% of the population has been vaccinated by mid-February. And this is really, really low number, which doesn't bode well for the future. So the lockdown will probably continue. The sectors will not be able to open up anytime soon. In the long term, of course, this goes way beyond the vaccination. This goes into the capacity of Jordanian government to implement reforms to stop being over-reliant on foreign assistance. The World Bank estimates that in 2021, the economy in Jordan will grow by 1.4%. But of course, in order to do that in the short term, Jordan has to keep on borrowing money and keep on relying on foreign aid, which is not a very sustainable long-term strategy. But I will finish on that because I believe in the next round, we'll be talking a little bit more about the foreign engagement in the Jordanian economy.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Katarzyna, for your contribution. And then we move to Tuka. And I would like to ask you, what are the main political demands in today Jordan? We saw during the previous two speeches, we talk more about demands and the different issues at stake. So I would like to have your opinion on this, and especially what is the present condition of social mobilization or collective action in the country?
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you to ISPI for convening this panel. Let me talk a little bit about a few trends when it comes to the social mobilization in Jordan. As my colleague Zaid mentioned, this incredibly low trust in government and the gap in trust in government has led Jordanians to completely disengage from the political system. So they don't believe in that their parliamentary representatives are going to carry their grievances up the chain, and that has driven many Jordanians into the streets during peak moments of frustration. So we've seen a number of consistent protests over the past decade. Most, in 2018, brought down the government when there was a proposed new income tax hike. And in 2019, the teachers syndicate also coalesced to strike for demanding an increase in wages. So the fact that people are not believing in government and in the institutions has driven them in some ways to the streets. Now, these protests have been consistent, but it's kind of a pattern where people go into the streets, they let out a lot of frustration. There's a crackdown, which is increasingly more harsh than it was before. And at the same time, activists are arrested or the press is completely constrained. There's a number of cyber laws and defense laws that have been enacted to really tighten the grip on these forms of dissent. So if Jordanians don't believe in their institutions and can't really protest, so that combines for a really combustible combination. That cycle of protest versus calming down versus crackdown has continued, and we saw most recently protests in light of COVID restrictions and COVID economic difficulties has continued. But the protesters are asking for the same thing and highlighting the same thing. As Professor Yadat said, the perception of corruption is a top concern for most Jordanians, and they're always looking internally at how significant amounts of foreign aid are mismanaged in their view, and continuously protesting lack of jobs, high cost of living, and this fraying of the social safety nets that existed before. Now, another trend is the fact that these protests are different than they were, let's say, in the before the Arab Spring. A lot of times they were predominantly represented by large parties like the Islamist movement in Jordan. Now you have a much younger population that is protesting through what is called the Hirak in Jordan, and you have a more diverse cross-section of Jordanians, including working class and middle class Jordanians that are incredibly frustrated and willing to go out into the streets and protest. So it's not limited to a certain group of people that are engaged in the political process as it was before. It's wider ability of people to feel like they can go on social media and protest, they can go into the streets and protest. And at the same time, this points to the lack of the ability of the Jordanian government to engage in a process of reconciliation, engage in discussions with key figures, whether it's tribal leaders, whether it's leaders of syndicates or people in the business community. This is not allowing Jordanians to engage in a process of being able to connect with the government. In the past, even the king, the late King Hussein was involved, when there was like big outbursts of protests. But right now, you feel like there is more of a crackdown, like I mentioned. Islamist parties have been extremely curtailed as the Muslim Brotherhood was tied down in 2015. And even when there are legitimate forms of participation, such as through professional syndicates, which have a long history of engagement in Jordan and political activity, like the example of the teacher syndicate is a prime example because, protesting aside, going on strike, a very democratic form of protest was completely muffled, and there was just no way that the government could reach a resolution between the teachers and the government. So those trends, like I mentioned, have driven Jordanians to protest in the streets, but it's a continuous cycle of protest, calming down, and then going back up again in the crackdown. But the demands are similar, and the demands are the same across the board every year after year, even if the reason for the outburst is different every year. So as my colleagues have mentioned, the COVID pandemic obviously has exacerbated the situation, but you've also seen that a number of indices of measuring freedoms and in Jordan have indicated that the country is going into the authoritarian realm. So while it was, often lauded as a country that is able to manage being a hybrid of a monarchy, but also allowing for parliamentary elections and small signs of freedom, it's really moving in the direction of more authoritarian, indications as well. So I'll leave the floor to my colleague, Dr. Momani, and then we'll continue the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tuka. And Besma, to remain in the political sphere of Jordan, I would like to ask you, how do you consider the relationship between Jordan population and the Jordanian institutions? So how we can develop what we have discussed since now?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think, Zaid had it really accurately that there is a sort of a deficit of trust in public institutions generally because of the perception of corruption, which is really the undergirding this whole discussion, I think, is this feeling that there isn't adequate redistribution of wealth, that there is, crony capitalism at the very top. There is a system that is not necessarily working in the public interest, but for their own personal interests. It doesn't help that I think that the political system also, while, I think there are significant political reforms, compared to the neighbors, often Jordan does that, it compares itself to its neighborhood. There are some positive political reforms that have been done that are a bit more inclusive. But at the same time, I don't think you can quite call it a full and full-fledged democracy in the way that we would think of in a Western sense. So there's still lots to improve on the political side. And so when people don't feel that they have a political voice, and that political voice is working for their own self-interest and not for the public good, there is, I think, dissatisfaction with the political process. So the institutions, and as pointed out, the security sector and the military certainly have respect for keeping the peace. But at the same time, the question is, that's not, I think, the foundation of a successful country to just solely rely on the security sector for one's faith and institutions. One needs to broaden that to include all aspects of the public sector, which is really difficult for most Jordanians to have trust in when there is, increasingly everything from petty corruption at the bureaucracy level to increasingly, I would say, a lot of waste, overemployment, a bloated public sector is what you could call it. And so that really just puts, I think, a lot of pressure on the, on the Jordanian state, if you will, to try and keep this aura of success. And often it, I think, derives that more externally than domestically. And I think that's a real challenge for any country, to really be more dependent on its external image than on its internal image. I always say it's, you don't want to be, working at, so I'm going to give you a Canadian kind of example. You don't want to be working at General Motors, but driving a Honda. And so my point here is that you need to, if you're going to be, I think, a successful country, you need the people to have as much faith in you as a country as external benefactors have of you. And that's a real gap in the Jordanian situation. I think there is probably more lauding of Jordan's role and, if you will, positionality externally than there is internally. And that is not, I think, a very good prognosis for the country, particularly because of the socioeconomic challenges that it's facing from a very, very young population, highly educated, which is a wonderful achievement, of course, for the country. But it's, I think, even more dangerous, if you will, if you have a highly educated society that doesn't have jobs, doesn't have opportunity. You know what you deserve, but you're not getting it. So it's actually even more problematic on a political side. And at the same time, the external community continues to put Jordan on a pedestal. And we see that from, I certainly have seen it from my vantage point of, at the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. People often think of Jordan as, obviously the most successful reformer in the region. And that, of course, comes with a great deal of social costs, because we know there's no mystery to the literature here that when one country pivots to a more neoliberal approach, a stronger private sector, it comes with a great deal of social adjustment costs. And we see today, as colleagues have pointed out, unemployment is a huge factor. And I do want to point out on COVID, which we know has aggravated all economic challenges for every country in the world, Jordan is even more so in that situation, because we know that unemployment has doubled just in the past year. Youth unemployment's always been usually, on average, double that of the national average. So you have that factor. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of, I think, good stories coming about the future of the global economy. My colleague talked about some of the forecasts that the World Bank has put forth. With all due respect, I think they're awfully optimistic forecasts, and they tend to be based on this reality that, and I read the fine print, I'm afraid, that the virus will be under control. And that's certainly not the case throughout much of the world. We can, I think in the West, some of us are patting ourselves on the back for getting a lot of people vaccinated, but that's not the case in much of the developing world. And in Jordan, you have the added factor, which, we don't talk about it nearly as much, but disinformation and misinformation about the actual vaccine. And so, as a person of Jordanian roots, I'm astonished to hear that, in fact, there's lots of people who won't take the vaccine. And that is not going to be a healthy recovery. If you're not only dependent on foreign aid, but also you're dependent on tourism receipts, I think people and tourists are going to be evaluating where they're going to take their vacations, also based on things like the positivity rates, the vaccination rates. That is going to be an important boost, if you will, for confidence in traveling there. So again, all of these things are really quite problematic. I'll just quickly add too, as a country that's highly dependent on workers' remittances, mostly from the Gulf, I don't see a very strong prospect for us going back to the consumption of oil and fuel in the same way that we once were. I think we've all had a very important conversation in the West, and I say the West because that's, at the end of the day, we are the biggest consumers of this. Increasingly talking about climate change and the impact of oil and fuel. So I think there are some what we call economic scarring in the system that are just not going to return. We're not going to go back to the fanciful $100 a barrel type prices. So I think we're looking at a very, very slow global economic recovery. And that doesn't bode well for Jordan, which is highly dependent on the external front, and also on donors. And I'll just leave on that part about the donors. I'll talk about my next segment about sort of the relationship with the donor community. But remember here, globally, every country is now introverted more so than ever. And that means that that fiscal space for a lot of countries to donate, to give towards official development agencies is diminishing. And I think people are rightly so going to be talking about, we need to invest in the home front. We all have in the West enormous amount of our own economic scarring and challenges. And so I think what's going to be a bigger challenge for Jordan is that foreign aid envelope is going to shrink significantly. And so the whole prognosis on the global economic side, in my humble opinion, is not good. And I'm afraid Jordan is going to have to sort of think about how it's going to manage the levers of political demands, which, as we heard from the previous panelists, is very much high and going to increase. It's not going to go away. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beth. Surely we will return on the issue of donors. Before starting the second round, I'm afraid we are running out of time. So we have more or less 20 minutes left for the second round. So I ask to each speaker to more or less remain within the limit. Of course, I invite you also to elaborate on any issue have been in a way raised by you or your colleague during the first round, regardless the main question that I will immediately pose. Zaid, I want to start from you again. What do you think can be the implication and impact on Jordan internal stability for the region? What do you see? What do you think? So going on with what we were discussing until now, especially with Besma, the project us on the internal dimension.
A lot, Paolo. But let me first just very quick comments and reflections on my colleagues' presentations, which I admire the three of them and their presentations. Thank you very much for that. But directly to Tuqa Sirat, and I like your notes about the al-hirak wal-ihtijajat and the changes for the last decade, if you wish, in terms of the demographic and the substance and the content of the hirak and the protests for the last decade. And what is striking actually in this issue is how organized, how energetic, and how, if you wish, courageous they are. Yet, we have to keep all in mind, despite all the negativism that's about Jordan and the economy and social internal stability, I think there is a consensus or quasi-consensus, something close to consensus, that, Jordanian wanted a reform, a serious, genuine reform within the house, not to overthrow the house. And I'm just relating this to the royal family, within, not without, with and within. So this is very important to keep in mind, because that actually leads us and leads our discussions, and also helps us understand the most recent events that did take place 3 weeks ago. And then Basma Momani, I'm delighted to see you again. I think we met once, I don't know, I'll be traveling or something, but I certainly admire and respect, and I agree what you've said. This global economic situation that's impacting Jordan, for sure, is just going to make Jordan's life harder and harder. There's no doubt about it. And the type of the political economy that is implemented in the country long away is all, about winners and losers, and the few wins and at the expense of the many. And, there was like an iron law, if you wish, that is the security and the safety of the budget of the state, which determines even our foreign relations. So taking all that together with the vaccination rate and with the tourism sectors and with all the positivities, etc., related to the pandemic itself, yes, I agree. And that's why, in our predictions and just, the scenarios building, the best scenario that will need 5 years to go back to the levels of the 2019. Now, taking that, and that how I'm going to link it to your question now about the internal and stability in Jordan and its relations to the neighbors. This certainly will impact in a very negative and strong way the social stability, socio-political stability in Jordan. So if anything, experts and organizations and concerns parties want to watch in is the domestic politics in Jordan rather than anything else, how this domestic politics will unfold. And Basma has, clearly pointed to the issue of the external image versus the internal image. For whom we are working as a state, as institutions, it is to win the trust of our citizens and to provide for their demands and to manage the resources, the very seldom scarce resources that we have, in a very professional and open and transparent way. So now, aside from that, and this is the asset for Jordan, it is the location. Just imagine Jordan is not in this part of the place. Let's say somewhere in Africa. Who will care about Jordan anyway? But this geostrategic location, although it brought with us all the challenges, as we know, you're dominated or surrounded by dominant powers, conflicts, instability, you name it. Not now. I mean, not even the last decades, all over. But for all important players in the Middle East, and I'm referring to the big four, if you wish. I'm referring to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, to Turkey, and even to the Emirates. Now, obviously, to Syria, to Iraq, and to Egypt. Jordan's stability is an asset as important. And any internal instability in Jordan will certainly spill over to the neighboring countries, especially. And this is probably unthinkable, especially to Israel. And therefore, the Jordan's strategic value for the region and for the international players, especially for the United States, in my mind, never lost its appealing. Maybe it is, bad mismanagement on the side of Jordan itself, but as a strategic value for the role Jordan has to do, especially for neighboring countries, I think Jordan has still a lot of that strategic value. Just imagine a destabilized Jordan and centralized authorities in Jordan neighboring Israel, with all the tensions between the populations and the images and et cetera, et cetera. And this should be a nightmare for Israel. So if Israel would come and, for example, just, and what they do on a regular basis, reevaluate the need for Jordan and Jordan's strategic value, I think this is a big, huge mistake. And this applies for other neighbors for sure. Jordan's for now certainly has contributed to the security in the Gulf countries, not only physically, but just bordering and securing the borders from ideas and activities, not only from ideas. So all in all, what I'm saying is Jordan internal stability and the continuation of a stable, calm Jordan that needs a lot of support, especially in economic situations, as we all agreed on, is a necessity for a crazy region that is the Middle East. Now, if I want to say something about the Middle East that Jordan lives with, and that's why Jordan stability is a strategic value and a necessity and a need for the players in the region and the global level, if you look at the region, you will see three important trends. First of all, of course, the Middle East that we know has collapsed a long time ago. We're living in a new Middle East with the new rules and new players. But within this new Middle East, politics is personal. It's not rational. And this is very serious and scary and threatening. And there's illusion of hegemony. Some certain players think that they can have the status of a hegemon. This is illusion and misleading. And the third, there is a serious nuclear threat, and that might lead to arms race and nuclear race. This is a crazy in its own region. Now, add to that instability in Jordan, you will just, set the entire region on fire. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zaid. Very, very clear, although very complex picture. But we know the challenges are many, and direction from where they come multiple. Katarzyna, I would like to go on with you on the external dimension of Jordan, talking about the relationship between the EU and Jordan. We know that EU and Jordan for both are important partners What do you think the EU should do or can do now for Jordan? In which area in particular?
Right. Yes, well, absolutely. Jordan is a strategic partner for the EU in the region and has been for many years. When cooperating with Jordan, the EU, of course, within the structures developed within previously the European neighborhood policy, regional stability and security has been one of the three main pillars for the cooperation between the EU and Jordan, and of course, macroeconomic stability and sustainability has been the second one. Now, a lot of times EU has been accused, not just in Jordan, on focusing too much of its own goals, not on the goals of the partner countries. There's been attempts in the new programming, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, Global Europe, very long name, DG, to kind of reverse that. So we don't know the details yet because the conversations are still undergoing with the partner countries. What the EU certainly wants to do for the entire region is to focus on green, sustainable development, digitalization, and so on. But for the particular focus for Jordan, like I said, we don't know the details yet. However, looking at the joint staff working document, which is the economic and investment plan for the southern neighborhood, we kind of can get a picture of what is going to be the main focus for the EU. So there are from things like upgrading the infrastructure, like the King Hussein Bridge, for supporting social assistance systems, to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, support the implementation of the energy sector strategy, which is definitely incredibly important for Jordan. Focusing on more technical things like solid waste management, we know how big of an issue water is for Jordan. Also in political terms, when it comes to cooperation with Israel and access to water. So those are certainly very important things that the EU wants to focus on. And in conversation with Jordan, now they will develop kind of more concrete goals. Now, in my opinion, what the EU has been doing correctly in a lot of countries in the Middle East is targeting an assistance in the form of budget support. So kind of directly supporting the budget of the government to allow the government to implement selected reforms as opposed to, giving loans or providing, concessional loans or providing guarantees to loans, which are also important, are also instruments that should be used. But with Jordan being so deeply over-reliant on help and having a really big debt, I think it will be very important for the EU to focus on this budget support and not to over-focus on concessional loans, which kind of has been part of the focus under the macro-financial assistance so far. So under the pandemic, of course, EU under the Team Europe has been supporting Jordan among other countries. There was a lot of technical help, testing systems, mobility of medical teams, data collection, and so forth. But the macro-financial assistance had a huge component of concessional loans to kind of support the support program that Jordan has agreed with the IMF, and that has been very much criticized among not only researchers, but also the population, perhaps not directly, but indirectly because of its effects on many layers of society. So to sum up, to leave some room for the debate as well, I would say that it will be very interesting to see what exactly the EU will release, apparently in mid-June, in terms of the concrete goals for the cooperation in Jordan. But my understanding so far is that it's going to be more focusing on more technical things like water infrastructure and connectivity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Katarzyna, very clear. Tuka, I would like to continue to the other strategic partner, or the real strategic partner for Jordan, that is the US, and especially after Biden election. How do you see their relationship in the near future, and what are the new opportunities that Jordan should take, or maybe in order?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the view here from Washington remains that Jordan is a very strong ally of the United States, and we don't foresee that changing anytime soon. Under the Trump administration, there was some unexpected and erratic actions that the administration took with regards to Israel. This definitely put Jordan on, kind of a tension between Jordan and the Trump administration. But still, Jordan remained a dependable ally, but was getting less, so to speak, love and care from the US, which was busy courting the Israeli Gulf normalization effort. Now, Jordan continues to be one of the largest recipients of US aid, getting about 1.5 billion US dollars annually. Most of that is in economic aid, while part of it is military aid. But a significant portion of that goes to support Jordan's efforts to host refugees. Jordan is only second to Lebanon in terms of its share of refugees as a percentage of its population. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, we can expect that Jordan is probably going to use the strains on its economy as a leverage demand, asking for more aid from the U.S. and international community. We can expect that the Biden administration will again continue to support that and allocate more aid, perhaps to vaccination efforts and healthcare efforts related to the refugee population. But as we saw in the immediate aftermath of the situation 2 weeks ago, or now 3 weeks ago, with Prince Hamza, there was unequivocal support voiced by President Biden, by Secretary of State Blinken, assuring the international community that Jordan has U.S. support. Of course, Jordan's stability and security is of utmost importance to the U.S. and Israel, and at the same time, the Jordanian role with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Jordan traditionally played a very active role in that effort. And we can expect that if the Biden administration hopes to revive some of those discussions outside of the parameters of the Abraham Accords, that it will involve Jordan more actively in that effort. The situation with Jordan being, seen as a secure part of the region actually is I want to point out that if people in Jordan don't feel like security is an issue for them, or terrorism, as was maybe 5-6 years ago with the rise of ISIS, means that Jordanians are focusing more internally on their economic and political reform process. So we're probably going to see that the Biden administration is going to quietly encourage some political and economic reform to ensure that these social tensions don't boil over and actually present a threat to neighboring Israel or to U.S. forces in Jordan. The U.S. has about 3,000 forces in Jordan. The security relationship is very strong. It was recently made stronger with this strategic agreement between the U.S. and Jordan. We think that in terms of the U.S. effort to slowly remove troops from the region, this kind of agreement allows U.S. forces to have access to security resources in Jordan, rather than having to have boots on the ground. But like I said, more U.S. aid more aid to Jordan from the U.S., more vocal support, maybe some quiet encouragement for reform, but no significant change that we foresee in the relationship between the U.S. and Jordan.
Thank you so much, Tuka. And Basma, I want to conclude this second round with you. You mentioned before the relationship with Donald. Now we saw with Katarzyna the relationship with the EU, with Tuka, with the US. I would like just to have your position on this topic. So the capacity of Jordan to attract assistance has been always important, and it will remain. So how do you see Jordan relationship in this field in the near future?
Yeah, thank you, Paolo. Well, I mean, Jordan has a balancing act that it needs to manage, and it's a really delicate one. And by that, I mean, on the one side, it's very dependent on not just foreign aid, but the entire external sector, right? So it's dependent on, obviously, FDI. It's dependent on, as I said, tourism, workers' remittances. So, the global stability is obviously very important to Jordan. But the key thing here is that it has a balancing act that I think is really important in terms of optics and in terms of reputation. So let me just paint a picture here. So Jordan has always been able to attract money, tourists, you name it, to this very idea that it's sort of this, a stable country in a neighborhood of instability. It's able to get foreign donors, particularly the EU, the US, and Western donors, to the notion that Zayed pointed out, which is that it's this moderate, pro-Western country. And certainly being a buffer state strategically to protect Israel, which I think is a really important part of the rationale. But here's the challenge. The challenge is that, increasingly the optics or the impression of Jordan is being diminished externally, slowly. And I'm saddened by that, because I think it really does have a lot of promising aspects to it. But, you're seeing increasingly new critics of the entire structure, whether it's in terms of civil society organizations. I mean, the fact that we've had organizations like Amnesty International, Transparency International, that have all kind of degraded Jordan is not helpful, or downgraded, I should say. Certainly, we have Western legislatures that are increasingly asking some very important questions. At the end of the day, they do have to, foreign donors have to also be mindful of their own domestic legislatures. And so increasingly questions about, well, how free is this country that we are supporting? And I point out here that, and I'm sure Tuchel can talk more about sort of the domestic situation in the United States, but just look at the US Congress today. It's increasingly very different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so countries like Saudi Arabia, which you sort of thought, okay, well, you would never, ever, shake that strategic relationship. These are being questioned from within. And so I think increasingly these legislatures are going to be more critical, and rightly so, partly because I guess information is increasingly more available to these, to these legislatures. There's now increasingly a diaspora that is now critical of their countries of origin and saying, well, wait a minute, while we want the success of these countries, we also want to see positive political reforms. We want to see democracy. And these things are not happening fast enough. So I think we have to balance this, right? Because Jordan wants to always be, again, put on that pedestal for being this great pro-Western state. But pro-Western is not just about being strategic and geostrategic positioning. It's also about values. It's also about how they treat people. It's also about, again, thinking about liberal values and democracy. And so I think it has to manage that. It can't continue to, I think, get all the benefits of being seen as pro-Western, but that on the inside, be more critical, arresting teachers, clamping down on protests. Those are not going to be successful or positive images for the state to take to foreign donors. So I think it needs to be very careful about that. And that is going to be a real struggle moving forward, because as I said earlier, the fiscal space for the Jordanian government is terrible. The consequences of the global economic crunch are going to squeeze donors' abilities to support it. And I think the global economic, just factors alone mean that Jordan is going to have a very rough ride. And it has a young population with very strong demand, including liberal democratic values, that it rightly deserves. It's an educated, population that is highly connected, increasingly well-traveled, I would say cosmopolitan in its own way, and wants all of the trappings of being called pro-Western. I mean, you can't say, Jordan is this great country, it's very Western, oh, but we can't give you democracy, right? So it can't have its cake and eat it too. It needs to think about, if it's going to live up to this wonderful image that it's curated for itself externally, it needs to adopt it internally as well.
Thank you so much, Vesma. I think also because Jordan is increasingly discussed through its challenges and so much more than it was before. So there is also a rising concern about the country that we are not so used, I mean, at least in the past. So it will be carefully checked and followed. We almost run out of time, but I think that is important at least to keep up some question for you. So we have 15 minutes left. I would like for sure to pick one question that is that can be answered by who wants, and it's not direct to anyone in specific. That is, what is the most significant barrier to reform in the kingdom? So we go back to what we discussed. And the question goes on saying, unfulfilled promises of reform has been a problem since before 1989. So is there anything different about this specific instance of political and social tension? So the comparison between the crisis or the period of crisis in 1989 with what we are witnessing now. Anyone of you want to pick up and start to answer?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, of course.
Sure. I mean, I think the concept of reforms internally and the audience member that asked the question is absolutely right. I mean, this has been a discussion that's ongoing and it hasn't ended. And I would say that, with all due respect, and I'm not suggesting that there haven't been positive changes. We've seen, I think, positive changes. But I don't think that the state and the powers that be ever really wanted to see Jordan become a full-fledged democracy. It's always kind of given a little, hoping that the population is satisfied with that little bit of, reform, and then it would just kind of quiet down. And then we've even seen, frankly, it taken back. Some of the sort of gains that have been made on the political liberalization front have been taken back. And the one thing, for example, sadly today, is freedom of speech. Increasingly there are gag orders. There are more and more kind of restrictions on new red lines, frankly. And we all thought we knew what the red lines were, but they increasingly change with time. And that, I think, is really problematic. And I don't think, again, and I have to reiterate this because I just feel that it's really important to point out, you cannot expect an educated, well-connected society of, Jordan is not North Korea, and the population of Jordan are highly intelligent, highly sophisticated, and I just don't think you can ask them to sort of not ask for demands that are commensurate with what you get when you have an educated, well-traveled, increasingly sophisticated society. It just doesn't happen that way. And one of the things that I think we have to be careful about is brain drain too. I mean, this has really become a real challenge for Jordan. I'm saddened when I see these fantastic surgeons outside of the country, the scientists, the professors. I mean, this is not healthy for a country. Jordan has so much potential because it invested in education, it invested in trying to get its society to think in that, frankly, in that cosmopolitan way. And it's been successful in some ways, but it can't do that and then put back in the genie in the bottle by saying, actually, you know what, we can't afford to have democracy now, or no, we don't want you to ask questions. They're going to ask questions. And what they do is just go to the web and Clubhouse and all these other platforms to ask the questions. So you just can't, I think, stop the natural political and social development of a population.
Thank you, Vesma. Zaid, please, the mic is yours.
Yes, full-fledged democracy, repeated many times by Vesma, and I love this term. However, you and I and the rest of us understand the logic of the transition theory itself. And, it's fluctuation, it's process, and it is democratization and de-democratization. It is liberalization and deliberalization. And we've been through that since 1989, not only in Jordan, but across the board. So if you compare it with Latin America, Eastern Europe, even the United States itself. So that is not like, just a given situation that democracy, and we stick to it, et cetera, democracy always wants people to protect it and to fight the protection of their freedoms. Just, a few months ago, we witnessed something in the United States that can just unthinkable. This revolution and a coup against the election itself and the constitution and the freedoms themselves in the United States. This is not to justify what's happening in Jordan. Actually, I'm taking this to say that democracy is not given. It's not something that is given to people. This is a struggle. This is a process. This is how this the Hirak. This is how the protest. This is how the entire internal dynamics should ally itself to. Now, what is a fact today for sure is that Jordanian will not accept anything than a genuine political reform, regardless. Period. However, this genuine political reforms is actually subject to so many other strategic concerns, including the Palestinian issue and including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And hence, I refer to the identity crisis in Jordan. And, in the depth discussion, Basma, it is not a straightforward argument that, Jordanians deserve and they have to have it. I tell you today, all these reports about freedom in Jordan actually are giving Jordan more than they should when it comes to freedom and democracy and liberties. However, these strategic protection for Jordan, for strategic reasons that has to do with the Palestinian issues and the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the identity evolving, the Jordanian identity, the Jewish identity, and the Palestinian identity, it really practice its impact on the path that Jordan should actually go through when it comes to political reform. But regardless of the reasons and regardless of the constraints, there is no other choice for Jordan but to go for a full-fledged democratization process that would lead to at least an agreed-upon consociational kind of power sharing in the country. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you. Zaid. Tuka, Katarzyna, do you want? Otherwise, I have another question that originally was for Zaid, but I think can be open to you as well. I was referring to what you said at the beginning about the data that you found in the service about the low trust in the public institution and in general the condition of the economy in Jordan, comparing to the recent IMF support for the country. So the question is, do you think this could carry significant implementation risk for reform under the donor supporter programs? And if yes, what are the areas would be most problematic in your view?
I'll be happy to answer if there's no one.
Of course, yeah, feel free to start.
All right.
It was for you originally.
All right, I'll take part of it at least. Well, look, I would like thank you, the audience who raised this very important questions. And as I said, and there's an agreement among us, the speakers today, that this lack of trust, this gap of trust existing between citizens and the institutions is serious, and it's only deepening and widening. And the IMF programs in Jordan actually, most of the time since 1989 and forward, been like the symbol of the Jordanian criticism because of the process of privatization and the structural changes to the economy and adjustments, and also all the other economic reform programs that's been seen by Jordanians as equivalent to first enriching few in Jordan at the expense of the others, especially the social network and the social safety net, and with the scandals of corruption. So what I'm saying, the new programs of the IMF is not going to help in changing numbers or of trust, or even, signaling to the Jordanian that these programs are now more productive and more conducive to a genuine economic reform that will deal with economic and societal issues, which will reflect positively on the people rating of the government and their performance. So unless there is an overall changes in the way the resources and in Jordan is managed and policies are conducted, including people in the decision-making process, by providing frames for that, I think it will continue and even getting worse. Basma was referring to the issue of education. Well, guess what, Basma and the rest? Bad news. We lost the edge, even in that. The knowledge gap in Jordan is terrifying. And Jordan's educational achievements compared to neighboring countries even is just, going down and down and down.
Thank you, Zaid. Basma, you want to react? No, because I saw the hands. I don't know if you were raising hands. So no, sorry. I apologize.
That's quite all right.
Tuka, yes, of course, welcome.
Yeah, I would like to chime in on the first question, just to go back for a second. There's the question about, the reform process from 30 years ago. So much has changed, but two of the most important things that I think have changed is the perception of what the government should provide to the people and the demands of that, whether it's through subsidies or through engaging with East Bank Jordanians and tribal leaders. There was a perception at the time that there is a bigger role for the government to play in providing a safety net for Jordanians. Now the government seems naturally pulling back because of a number of different economic and structural issues, has to pull back a little bit. And so there's this gap in, generations of understanding where the role of government is in supporting individual people's, stability and their ability to put food on the table and their ability to have a job. And at the same time, there's a huge gap in the type of information space that we have now. So any kind of scandal with regards to corruption, even with the restrictions that are existing on the domestic media, it's very hard to control the story on social media. It's hard to control the story in international press, as we recently saw. So Jordanians have access to a lot more information than they did 30 years ago about what is their government receiving in terms of aid, what is the fiscal health of the country, and also this increasing gap between a very small section of wealthy Jordanians. People can see on social media when they can't even afford to go to college, but there are certain Jordanians who, are representative of a small group that have access to resources and positions that set them, very, very far apart from the average Jordanian. So those are, I think, two elements that point to some of the differences that we're seeing now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Tuka. Yeah, for sure, Katarzyna. So you will conclude our seminar. So please, the mic is yours.
Well, of course, there's a lot to add, but all the points that were brought by the previous speakers are very valid. I would perhaps just add that on the issues of trust is absolutely necessary. Without it, no reform can really be implemented. Thinking about the tax reform, if people don't trust that if they pay taxes, they share their income, it will be used in a good way. Of course, this will not be successful. And that also corresponds with the issue of transparency. Like the government needs to be very open and clear why certain reforms are needed. How are they going to be implemented? What are they going to do? Like Tuka said, to make sure that the hard reforms that needs to be implemented, removing some of the subsidies, introducing taxes. What are they going to do to mitigate the impact on the most vulnerable sectors of the society, and then continue to inform about that in a transparent way, basically treating people like equals and moving out from the paternalistic approach towards the citizens. I absolutely agree that the Jordanian society is not going to tolerate the situation, like Basma said, anymore in terms of not having democracy, but trying to have the benefit of having an image of democracy abroad. So apart from trust, transparency is absolutely the key and a way to go if the government wants to have a buy-in from the population with the reforms that it absolutely needs to introduce if it wants to save the economy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katarzyna. So we are run out of time. So I apologize first of all with the audience if some of the questions, many questions of reality have not been taken and so answered. I apologize for this, but in any case, I think that our panelists, our speaker, have really provided a very interesting picture about Jordan today, all the challenges and dynamics at stake. So I thank you so much for your participation, for your contribute, and see you next time, hopefully with a better picture and a better situation for the kingdom, for the Jordan. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Zaid, Katarzyna, Tuka,
Bye.
and Besma. Thank you so much.
Bye.